Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a conqueror, but with a few accidents of fate so bizarre that even the medieval church had to pause and say, okay, that's weird. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's hazy little journey together. The same bell for both souls. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The slow, deliberate tolling of the cathedral bell, its tone rolling through damp English air. It is the sound of routine, not tragedy. Yet on one strange evening in 1239, that same bell was rung twice, for two deaths that seemed to share one heartbeat. You are in Canterbury, a city still healing from the turmoil of Becket's martyrdom generations earlier. The cobbled lanes smell faintly of tallow and malt. Parchment makers rinse hides in the river. The Benedictine monks of Christ Church Priory live to the rhythm of their bells. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers. Theirs is a life meant to erase individuality. And yet within that sameness, history found room for a coincidence so perfect it would puzzle chroniclers for centuries. The Priory's records mention two brothers, Edwin and Aldred de Harewood, born in the same village outside York, but separated as children during a famine. Edwin was left at the gates of St. Peter's Abbey. Aldred was taken by traders south and eventually given to a guild in Canterbury. They never met again, or so the record claims. Both entered monastic life. Both took the Benedictine habit, and both spent decades copying scripture, repairing roofs, tending bees. The first entry appears in the Annals Cantuariensis. In the year of our Lord 1239, on the feast of St. Swithin, Brother Aldred fell in the scriptorium and departed this life. At the same hour, a northern house recorded the death of his brother Edwin, unknown to us until letters arrived. Modern historians dismiss it as coincidence. Medieval chroniclers saw divine geometry, two lives folded neatly along the spine of a single day. But to understand why the story lingered, you need to imagine the world through their parchment-stained eyes. The monks believed time itself could echo. When one soul rose, another might fall to keep the scales even. Such thinking wasn't superstition. It was the quiet arithmetic of medieval faith. In those years, communication between abbeys took weeks. Yet the two obituaries, when compared later by a traveling bishop, recorded identical hours of death, just after sext, as the bell rang once for prayer. To medieval minds, that could only mean providence or something stranger. Let's linger for a moment in the scriptorium at Canterbury. The afternoon light filtered through oiled parchment windows. Brother Aldred sits hunched over a missal, his wrist wrapped with linen against the chill. Quills scrape. Sand scatters. The scent of ink is thick as burnt almonds. The silence is broken only by the turning of pages and the rhythmic breath of men who have forgotten their own names. Aldred coughs, nothing unusual. Winter dampness always lingers. He presses his hand to his chest, mutters a prayer in Latin that even he barely hears, and keeps copying. Et lux in tenebris lucet. And the light shineth in darkness. When he collapses, The others think he has merely fallen asleep. It takes several minutes for anyone to move. Death, in a monastery, is not noisy. They close his eyes, finish the line of ink, and mark the parchment with a cross. Hundreds of miles north, in a dim hall near York, Brother Edwin does the same. He, too, is writing from the Gospel of John. He, too, stops at the very same verse. We don't know how such parallel detail entered the records. Perhaps a later scribe embellished. Perhaps monks love symmetry as much as theologians do. But the margins of both manuscripts, still preserved in fragments, carry the same small note in red: Obiit frater noster in pace. He died in peace. The twins were buried beneath different skies, yet their epitaphs, copied by different hands, shared the same wording, right down to the misplaced comma. Was it coordination? Impossible, given the distance and delay. Was it chance? Statistically trivial, but symbolically vast. When the traveling bishop, Walter of Eynsham, visited Canterbury months later, he brought the Northern Annal with him. Reading the two records side by side, he reportedly whispered, "God writes poetry even in dust." That phrase became proverbial among scribes for generations. They used it when ink spilled, when candles sputtered, when lines repeated by accident. It meant patterns exist even when reason sleeps. The story's power lies less in miracle than in monotony. The twin monks were not heroes. They were men who spent their lives making other people's words permanent. Their sameness, their repetition, was their virtue, and perhaps that very sameness invited coincidence. Think of how medieval lives repeated one another. Each dawn, the same psalms. Each meal, the same barley. Each confession, the same sins. When existence is so patterned, is it surprising that deaths align? Still, the human mind searches for meaning. The chronicler who wrote the annals could not resist drawing a moral. Thus are brothers joined when ink and prayer conspire. Centuries later, in the 14th century, a novice named Martin of Greenwood unearthed Aldred's old desk while repairing the floorboards. Hidden inside was a sliver of parchment inscribed with only a single line: "When one quill breaks, another must follow." Some called it prophecy, others coincidence once again. Yet every few generations, the tale was retold in the dormitories to lull new novices to sleep. They would whisper, "Write carefully. Your twin may finish your line elsewhere." To modern ears, it sounds fanciful, but to those monks, the world was an echo chamber of divine intent. Their God was not a distant figure, but a craftsman who loved recurring patterns, like twin spirals in a shell or brothers dying in unison. When you walk today through the ruins of Christ Church Priory, you can still hear the sea wind moving through the empty cloisters. It sounds like breath, or perhaps the faint scrape of quills across forgotten vellum. And if you pause by the cracked stone where Aldred's name is half erased, you might notice how the lichen forms two identical circles side by side. Nature still copying itself. Centuries melt away, and you realize this. Medieval history is not always grand battles or kings. Sometimes it is simply two anonymous men whose lives rhyme so perfectly that time itself seems to wink. But here is the part historians never settled. How did the two abbeys record the exact same verse as unfinished? How could both quills have stopped at et lux in tenebris lucet, without any contact, coincidence, or connection. The letters that crossed in silence. The winter following the deaths of the two monks was a season of relentless fog. Travelers wrote that the roads between Canterbury and York seemed to vanish beneath one's feet, as though England itself hesitated to be seen. It was during this season that the letters began to travel. 2 packets of parchment, each sealed with the same crimson wax, each addressed to the other's abbey, and each unaware that the man to whom it was written no longer breathed. The first letter came from the north. A messenger named Ralph of Haxby carried it wrapped in oiled leather. His horse, pale with frost, left no tracks on the frozen mud. Inside, the abbot of St. Peter's Abbey wrote to his brother in Christ at Canterbury, "It is with sorrow we tell you of Brother Edwin's peaceful passing, at Sext on the feast of St. Swithin. He was copying the Gospel of John, and his last breath was upon the verse, Et lux in tenebris lucet. We have buried him beneath the yew, where the snow gathers evenly. Pray for him, as we shall for you all." The second letter left Canterbury the same morning, bound for York. It said precisely the same thing, with only the names exchanged. When the 2 couriers crossed paths somewhere along the Great North Road, neither had cause to stop. The fog made the world seem smaller, the air thick with the hush of shared ignorance. Weeks later, each abbot received the other's notice, and confusion turned to awe. Neither letter could have been written in response to the other. Both bore the same date, and were sealed within hours of the same death. It was the kind of symmetry medieval minds adored. The chroniclers saw the hand of God in postal coincidence, the divine timing of messengers who could not have planned such alignment. But what truly troubled the monks was what came next, the evidence that one brother had known of the other's death before any messenger could have told him. In St. Peter's Abbey, Edwin's cell was small, its walls carved with shallow crosses where his fingers had traced nightly prayers. Beneath his straw mattress, the novices found a folded scrap of parchment bearing only these words, "Aldred is called. I follow." The writing was unmistakably Edwin's. The ink had barely dried before his death, and the line trembled slightly, as if written in haste. How could he have known? The monks debated for weeks. Some argued that the brothers shared a spiritual bond, forged in their mother's womb, that allowed one soul to feel the silence of the other. Others insisted that Edwin had dreamt of Aldred's death and taken it as a summons, fulfilling the dream with obedience rather than fear. The annals record the conversation of the chapter meeting held to decide what to do with the note. Some believed it blasphemous to keep it. Others wanted it copied into the monastery's miracle register. The abbot, cautious as always, ordered that it be sealed within the Liber Fratrum, the book that kept each brother's name and year of death. He wrote in the margin, "So passes faith from one breath to the next, and so shall it ever." Down in Canterbury, the same debate unfolded. Aldred, too, had left a note, if it could be called that. On his desk, next to the unfinished gospel, a second parchment was found. It bore a single smudge of ink and a line, written as though mid-thought. "When I go not alone." There was no signature. No one could be certain it was his hand. But the phrasing, the quiet certainty, it felt like a reply. Centuries later, historians would try to measure coincidence by the tools of reason, shared illness, synchronized routines, or the slow, fatal hum of monastic pneumonia. Yet those explanations never satisfied the medieval chroniclers. To them, the coincidence was not a riddle to be solved, but a pattern to be contemplated. Even now, if you stand in Canterbury Cathedral's archives and look closely at the vellum, you can see where the ink from Aldred's final words bled faintly through the page, forming a ghostly mirror image. Two halves of one message, forever seeping toward each other. The monks of both abbeys began to correspond more regularly after that, exchanging small stories of coincidence, perhaps seeking to make sense of what they had witnessed. They compared weather, omens, even candle lengths. One letter from Canterbury mentions that Aldred's candle burned longer than any recorded in the priory's history, exactly 12 hours, from sext to sext. The brothers in York replied that Edwin's had done the same. And so a quiet superstition was born, that the two abbeys shared not only a faith but a rhythm of time, like lungs breathing the same air. By 1241, pilgrims had begun whispering of the twin bell miracle. They came to both sites, touching the stones where each monk had fallen, and leaving offerings of paired objects: 2 beads, 2 feathers, 2 coins. Some came seeking love, others luck, but most came simply to feel that symmetry, to believe the world could still align itself in something pure. Naturally, the church disapproved. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a decree forbidding the spread of such tales. He wrote, "Coincidence is not sanctity, and repetition is not revelation." Yet the story persisted, softened by retelling, woven into sermons and bedtime tales for novices. Over time, the twins themselves faded from focus. What remained was the notion that some bonds outlast knowledge, that two people, moving in perfect parallel, could live and die as reflections unaware of one another. It is an oddly comforting thought, even now. Imagine them, 2 men bent over the same verse, miles apart, each surrounded by the same smell of wax and wool, each hearing the same bell at the same hour. They were, in a sense, the embodiment of medieval repetition, the belief that life was a series of circles rather than lines. When the bishop visited York to confirm Edwin's burial, he ordered the twin graves marked with matching stones. On each, the same inscription, Lumen in tenebris lucet. The light shines in darkness. For generations, monks recited that line when beginning new manuscripts. It was less a tribute to the dead than a small nod to continuity, the belief that even in unremarkable acts, there lies the rhythm of the eternal. But of course, questions linger. How could 2 monks, separated by miles and silence, both leave messages that seem to answer each other? Did one copy the other years earlier? Were those lines part of a shared devotional phrase now forgotten? Or was it truly an echo carried through faith or fate? Perhaps it doesn't matter. History often offers more patterns than proofs. And in that fog-shrouded winter of 1239, 2 abbeys found themselves bound by one of the quietest mysteries the Middle Ages ever recorded. You can still trace their story in the margins of illuminated texts, twin initials drawn by nervous scribes, twin candle holders cast in bronze, twin gravestones weathered smooth. The evidence of coincidence becomes, itself, a kind of devotion. And maybe that was always the point. If meaning could be found in such mirroring, then perhaps the world itself was not chaos, but design. Still, one document discovered in the 15th century unsettled even the most faithful believers. It was a fragment of correspondence from an unnamed monk of Canterbury to a northern brother describing a dream. I saw two figures at a desk, each writing the other's name. And when they finished, the ink turned to light. Was it a later invention? A poetic flourish added centuries afterward? The handwriting cannot be dated with certainty, but the archivist who handled it noticed something odd. The ink on the parchment was duplicated on the reverse side, as though pressed against another page long ago, one now lost. A mirror image, once again. Was that simply the nature of vellum, or another pattern repeating itself through time? No one knows. And so the tale of the twin monks remains not a miracle, not a myth, but a meditation on coincidence, the kind that made medieval hearts both comforted and uneasy. You might wonder, as the monks once did, what does it mean when two lives rhyme so perfectly? Is it design or accident? Fate or rhythm? Perhaps the better question is this: how many such coincidences have passed unnoticed, unrecorded, lost in the fog between abbeys? The mirror in the monastery. The decades that followed the strange deaths of the twin monks blurred quietly into the ordinary rhythm of English monastic life. The 13th century gave way to the 14th, and both Canterbury and York endured plagues, fires, and the slow reforms that would later fracture Christendom. Yet somehow, the story of Aldred and Edwin remained. It did not grow, as legends often do. It simply persisted, tucked like a bookmark between the pages of the centuries. When the Black Death came in 1349, it emptied entire dormitories. But among the few possessions carefully catalogued and burned to prevent contagion, a scribe noted one small object rescued from Aldred's old desk, a piece of polished tin, oval and faintly warped, framed in oak. A mirror, though few monks owned such things. In a world where vanity was a sin, mirrors were used mostly by illuminators to catch the light just right on gold leaf. The mirror was said to have belonged to Aldred, and in its dull reflection, the surviving brothers saw a strange symbol of his story, a surface where one side always echoed the other. It was placed upon the wall of the new scriptorium, more as a curiosity than a relic. Over the next century, novices whispered that it sometimes clouded with breath when no one was near, or that faint writing appeared on it by candlelight. Sensible monks dismissed such talk. Still, few cared to face it after dark. The object endured plague, reform, and the slow collapse of monastic libraries. When Henry VIII's commissioners dissolved the monasteries in 1539, a clerk recorded the confiscation of one small mirror of polished tin, much vaunted by the brethren as a token of their twins. The entry sat between items of little worth, 3 pewter spoons, and a single book of homilies much worm-eaten. No one knows what became of the mirror afterward. Some say it was melted down with the rest of the abbey silver, others that it passed through generations of local families, hidden in plain sight. Yet its last recorded mention appears in a 17th century private journal kept by a certain Thomas Wotton, a minor antiquarian who visited Canterbury in 1662. He wrote, "In ye market house I saw a thing of old fashion, being a mirror of tin. The keeper said it came from the monastery. and that in it once was seen two faces though, but one man stood before it. I would have bought it, but he refused, fearing it unlucky. It is, perhaps, just another coincidence that an object linked to twin reflections should resurface centuries later in the hands of a man obsessed with dualities. But coincidence, after all, is what this story has always been about. In the 18th century, antiquarians began to rediscover monastic manuscripts, rummaging through trunks and attics for anything that survived Henry's purge. Among the papers rescued from a damp cellar in York was a water-damaged register, its ink faded to brown ghosts. It was titled Liber Fratrum Mortuorum, the Book of the Dead Brothers. Inside, between the years 1239 and 1240, two nearly identical entries appeared once again. Brother Edwin de Harewood died in the hour of Sext, the feast of Saint Swithin. Brother Aldred de Harewood died in the hour of Sext, the feast of Saint Swithin. Below each, a later hand had scrawled a note, perhaps by some reflective monk in the 14th century. They met not in life, nor in sight, yet perhaps in reflection. It was this phrase that first drew modern historians to the story, though none could decide if it referred to literal reflection, the mirror, or spiritual reflection, the kind the church loved to praise in sermons. But what mattered more was the pattern itself. How did such symmetry survive centuries of retelling without distortion? Every retelling of a medieval tale usually grows horns and wings, but this one stayed eerily simple. Two brothers, same day, same verse, same death. That simplicity is its mystery. The historian E. G. Lamb, writing in 1898, suggested that the mirrored legend of Aldred and Edwin represented the medieval mind's fascination with divine correspondence, the belief that God's handwriting could be seen in human repetition. To medieval people, Lamb argued, coincidence was not accidental, it was language. He called the story a parable of sameness. And though he did not believe the deaths literally synchronized, he saw in their documentation a reflection of how monks perceived time, not as a straight road, but as a circle traced over and over again by the same prayers that I in that sense. The twin monks are less about two men and more about one human idea, that the universe occasionally arranges itself to whisper, everything connects. But let us return, for a moment, to the medieval silence itself. Imagine standing in that priory after Aldred's death, before the legend grew teeth. The monks had laid him in the cloister chapel. The air smelled of beeswax and damp stone. Brother Matthew, his closest friend, had been tasked with preparing the body. He later wrote in the margin of a psalter, "He seemed only sleeping, as if he waited for a reply." When Matthew opened Aldred's palm to place the prayer beads, he found a small sliver of polished tin resting against the skin, the mirror. How had it gotten there? Some said Aldred carried it always, to catch daylight while writing. Others whispered it was a keepsake from his brother's youth, the only relic of their childhood before they were divided by famine. If that were true, the mirror was a relic of a bond no one remembered, but that somehow endured. Over the centuries, the story became something monks told one another when the nights grew long. "Be careful what verse you choose to die upon," they would say, half laughing. It may be someone else's too. And yet there's something haunting about that shared verse. Et lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in darkness. For men who spent their lives enclosed by stone, it must have felt like a prophecy fulfilled not once, but twice. Even now, if you visit the site of the old Canterbury Priory, you can see the faint remains of the scriptorium walls. At certain hours, when the sun hits the sandstone at an angle, two window shadows overlap, perfectly symmetrical, like eyes. Locals call it the twin light. Scholars, naturally, dismiss this as coincidence. But coincidence, as the monks believed, is just another word for harmony unseen. In 1911, an excavation near York uncovered fragments of two gravestones bearing nearly identical Latin inscriptions. One had been used, centuries later, as part of a barn floor. The archaeologists noted that the lettering style suggested both stones were carved by the same mason, perhaps commissioned together, though separated by distance. The mason's mark, a small looped M, appears on both. Was it possible that the same craftsman carved them? The records say no. The travel time, the lack of roads, the cost. It would have been impractical. Yet the evidence sits in museums today, two half-erased epitaphs that rhyme even after 700 years. Sometimes the persistence of a pattern is explanation enough. The last known mention of the twins comes from a letter written in 1794 by an English poet, Charlotte Hearn, who claimed to have seen the mirror of the monks in a private collection. She described it as tarnished to dull silver, yet when I looked upon it, it seemed as though my reflection blinked a heartbeat after my own. Her letter continues. Perhaps the glass remembers what it has seen and repeats what it can no longer touch. I thought I glimpsed behind me two figures bending over parchment, but when I turned, there was only the candle. Of course, no historian takes this seriously, but in the dim corner of the British Library where Hearn's papers rest, archivists sometimes note a curious pattern. When the pages are stacked, the ink impressions of her handwriting align almost perfectly from one sheet to the next, as if copied by mirror. Coincidence, again, or perhaps history's sense of humor. So what remains of Aldred and Edwin now? No bones, no relics, no proven mirror. Only the notion that two lives once ran parallel so closely that death could not tell them apart. Perhaps they were not twin souls at all, just two men whose lives happened to echo. Yet the monks who wrote about them found in their coincidence a comfort the modern world often forgets. That repetition, far from meaningless, might be the universe's way of saying, you are part of something larger. When you think of medieval time, its endless prayers, its cycles of work and silence, you begin to see why such a story would endure. It gave shape to monotony. It told them that even the dullest hours might align into something sacred. Aldred and Edwin's story became, in the end, a quiet theology of pattern. And so, every time a quill dipped into ink, or a bell rang twice in close succession, a few monks would smile faintly and whisper, "The brothers are still speaking." But here is where our story closes, or nearly. In 2023, a restorer cleaning a medieval psalter at the British Library found two overlapping notes in faded iron gall ink. One read, "When one quill breaks," the other, faintly beneath it, said, "Another must follow." The handwriting did not match, but the lines fit perfectly, like call and response. One on the recto page, one on the verso, each written centuries apart. The restorer called it a remarkable coincidence. Of course it was, because in history, as in reflection, sometimes the pattern matters more than the proof. And so ends the story of the twin monks of Canterbury. 2 lives, 1 bell, and an echo that never quite faded. When the bells ring twice. By the time the story of the twin monks reached its quiet twilight in memory, England had changed beyond recognition. The monasteries that once echoed with Gregorian chant had been stripped bare, their stones built into barns, their manuscripts scattered or burned. Yet the tale of Aldred and Edwin de Harewood survived, not in the formal registers of the church, but in the gentler folklore of the countryside. Old farmers in Kent would tell their children that when the cathedral bell rang twice at the same pitch, 2 souls had found one another across the divide. Fishermen off the southern coast whispered that twin ripples in still water were the monks walking home. Even in the 19th century, local schoolchildren played a game called Mirror Monk, tracing circles in the dust and chanting, light in darkness, dark in light. That persistence alone says something. For in a world built upon repetition, the turning of seasons, the rhythm of prayer, the endless rewriting of the same Latin phrases, the idea that coincidence could hold meaning was strangely comforting. It is easy, centuries later, to forget how deeply medieval people listened to time. The bell ruled every hour, when to rise, when to eat, when to pray, when to die. The ringing was not just sound, it was structure. And for the monks of Canterbury and York, those bells became the heartbeat of their faith. When Aldred and Edwin died, the record says both abbeys tolled the same bell, a C-note bronze tuned to what the church called the voice of mercy. It was the tone used for sext, the midday prayer. But after the story spread, some insisted that the 2 bells were forged from the same casting, sister bells born of the same mold, divided long ago by commerce and distance. There is no proof of this, yet the notion itself fits the pattern too neatly to be ignored. 2 bells, 2 brothers, 1 note forever shared between them. In 1882, an antiquarian named Reverend Martin Hollis attempted to trace the bell's origins. His letters describe a visit to the foundry at Gloucester, where he discovered a surviving mold pattern from the early 1200s. 2 bells cast on the same day for delivery to separate abbeys. One inscribed lumen, the other tenebrae, light and darkness. Hollis concluded, almost wistfully, that the story of the twin monks had perhaps begun not with 2 men, but with those bells. Sound itself was the twin, he wrote. Men merely echoed it. Still, there remains something more personal, more human, at the core of this tale, something that outlived its records and its relics. When the old cloisters of Christ Church Priory were excavated in 1934, workers uncovered a buried niche beneath what had once been the scriptorium floor. Inside lay a corroded box sealed with pitch. Within it, preserved against the damp, were 2 small items, a pair of identical quill knives and a single scrap of vellum, blank on one side, faintly ink-stained on the other. Under ultraviolet light, archivists discovered ghost letters bleeding through the blankness. The words were incomplete, broken by centuries of decay, but fragments were legible enough to chill even the most rational scholars. For when you fall silent, I shall. The rest had been lost to time. The find drew modest attention in local papers. Mysterious relic found at Canterbury, but no academic journal took it seriously. The box vanished into the cathedral archives, where it sits to this day, catalogued only as unidentified monastic container, ca 13th century. And yet, to the archivists who have handled it, the air around the box feels unnervingly still, as though the centuries hold their breath. Perhaps what makes this story endure isn't the coincidence itself, but the comfort it offers, the thought that even the dullest, most repetitive lives can align in beauty without design. Two brothers who never met lived almost identical days, waking, praying, writing, sleeping. Their deaths, aligned so precisely, became less tragedy and more symmetry. In the medieval imagination, that symmetry was not chance but assurance, proof that the universe, vast and indifferent, still folded its corners neatly. You can sense that craving for order in every surviving text from the age. The careful charts of moon cycles, the obsessive tallying of relics, the monks' endless copying of the same gospels. To them, perfection meant repetition, and the story of the twin monks became a parable of that perfection, a sign that faith itself could repeat across lives. Even today, scholars argue about what the coincidence means. Some see it as a proto-psychological case of twin telepathy, others as a statistical fluke amplified by the poetic nature of medieval chroniclers. But for most listeners, the charm lies in the quiet impossibility of it, the idea that life could write such parallel sentences and sign them off in the same hand. Picture it, if you will, a gray English afternoon. The cathedral bells toll for sext. The sound rolls across farmland, over hedgerows and stone bridges, all the way north to a monastery where another bell, smaller but tuned the same, answers. The air hums with correspondence, and for one suspended moment, two places become one. The monks pause, listening. Somewhere, parchment rustles. Somewhere else, a candle gutters. No one notices the echo fading into silence, except, perhaps, those two men, wherever they have gone. In the centuries since, the story has acquired a final phrase, an addition by those who love closure. It first appears in a handwritten sermon dated 1621, delivered in Canterbury during the reign of James I. Fear not coincidence, for even accidents may rhyme. The phrase reappears, almost verbatim, in a sermon printed in York 50 years later. Two preachers, one message, one phrasing. Coincidence again, or tradition repeating itself, as it always has. Somewhere between faith and pattern lies the comfort of this entire tale, that nothing, truly, stands alone. Not a word, not a bell, not a death. Everything echoes. Modern visitors to Canterbury Cathedral rarely hear the full peal anymore. The city's noise drowns out the subtler tones, and few remember that one of those bells, the oldest, bears a faint inscription on its rim, Lumen in Tenebris. The other half of the phrase, Lucet, was lost when the matching bell cracked centuries ago. Yet, when restorers struck that surviving bell for testing in 2019, they recorded something unexpected, a faint secondary resonance, a ghost tone overlapping the main pitch by half a beat. The technicians called it a sympathetic harmonic. To those who know the story, it is something else entirely. They say it is the second bell, still answering from afar. And so the legend closes where it began, with sound. From two brothers hunched over the same verse, to two bells ringing across centuries, to two faint vibrations caught on modern instruments, the pattern holds. Coincidence stretches like a thread across time, unbroken, unprovable, yet undeniably present. Whether you see it as miracle or mere mathematics doesn't matter. The monks of Canterbury would tell you that meaning hides in repetition, that the universe itself prays in cycles. Their lives, small and forgettable, became one such prayer. Two verses of the same psalm, sung on the same day, fading into the same silence. Close your eyes. Listen. The echo you hear might be the tolling of a bell long gone, or perhaps just your own heartbeat mirrored in history. Either way, the message remains. When one quill breaks, another must follow. When one bell rings, another must answer. And somewhere, in that faint harmony between distance and time, the twin monks of Canterbury still write.